A struggling farmer shared his last meal with a dying chief. He returned with 5 girls that changed the farmer's life forever. The years that swept across this wild land were like gusts of wind, blowing away memories and wearing down hearts that were thought to have turned to stone. In 1884, in a dusty settlement known as Lone Star, the silence on Arthur Blackwood's ranch wasn't the peaceful quiet of a soul at rest, but the heavy shroud of a grave, burying the past. 2 years. 2 years had passed since the day his world fell apart, and the echo of a family that was no more remained louder than any sound in the world. Do you enjoy stories of romance in the Wild West? Let us know by commenting 1 and sharing where you're from. Every morning, the sun would claw its way over the horizon, casting a harsh, white light onto the parched land. It fell upon a rickety house with peeling paint, a fence just as crooked, and a solitary man. His name was Arthur, but in the quiet chambers of his own mind, he bore another, more honest title, Grief Walker. Arthur's life wasn't a flow, but a series of mechanical, repetitive actions. He rose before dawn, breathing in the scent of dry earth and old, decaying wood. He went to the well, his calloused hands gripping the cold crank, its groan the only cry in the morning stillness. He milked his old cow, his eyes not on the animal but staring through it, to a distant place only he could see. It was a home he had been building, a flourishing garden, and a rocking chair on the porch where he and Eleanor had sat, hand in hand. The memory of Eleanor never arrived like a storm, but like 1,000 tiny dust motes, accumulating day by day, hour by hour. He saw her reflection in the glass of a window pane, heard her laughter in the wind's low sigh. His sorrow had transformed everything into a museum of loss. The rocking chair was still there, in the corner, where she had sat knitting for the son they never had. He couldn't bring himself to move it, to even touch it. It was a scar, not on his skin, but on his very soul. Grief wasn't a feeling. It was a state of being. It was the empty ache in his stomach whenever he sat down to eat, the heavy weight on his shoulders as he stooped to mend the falling fence. The fence, again. It was a mirror of his own spirit, rotting, fragile, just waiting for a strong wind to bring it all down. The field in front of his house, once lush and green, was now a desolate, yellow wasteland of weeds and dust. And then change came. It arrived not in the form of a storm or an explosion, but as a small, dark speck on the familiar trail. The speck grew larger, slowly, like a blot of ink on the silver-colored canvas of the desert. Arthur watched it, his hands falling limp at his sides, his heart filled with suspicion. He had learned that on this land, strangers rarely brought good tidings. As the man came closer, Arthur recognized him as a Native American, his hair and beard silver with age, his face etched with wrinkles. He rode a gaunt, skeletal horse, but on his face, despite his exhaustion and pain, was an expression of dignity, a spirit that refused to be broken. Arthur, a man accustomed to isolation, stood motionless. He neither advanced nor retreated. He simply watched. The Native American, as if he had spent his last ounce of strength, fell from his horse. Arthur, still and quiet as a dead tree, saw the old man struggle to rise, his tired eyes filled with an unbreakable hope. There was something in that gaze, a boundless sorrow, yet also fierce determination, that reached a deep, forgotten corner of Arthur's soul. It was a corner he had thought sealed forever by his own grief. His mind became a battlefield. On one side, the voice of isolation, the voice of his old, familiar pain, urged him to turn away. "All the trouble in the world comes from other people," it whispered. "Let him be." But on the other, a different voice, thin as a thread but full of strength, rose up. It was Eleanor's voice, not a physical sound, but a feeling, a deep-seated urge. "Compassion doesn't die, Arthur," it said. "It just sleeps." In the end, compassion won. Arthur moved forward, his feet heavy. He approached the man, recognizing Tashunka, an old chief. He saw the suffering on his face, saw his hands clenched tight, as if trying to hold on to something. Arthur, with the gruffness of a man who had lived too long with his pain, asked curtly, What do you need?" Tashunka, with a supreme effort, lifted his head. He looked straight into Arthur's eyes, his gaze full of wisdom, as if seeing past his rugged exterior and into his wounded heart. He didn't ask for food or water. He simply spoke a name, a moniker that had clung to Arthur in his loneliness. Grief Walker. That name, spoken by a stranger, moved him profoundly. It wasn't a judgment, but an understanding. It was like a stranger passing by a ruined garden and knowing what it once was. Tashunka saw not just Arthur's pain, but the kindness still buried deep inside him. He placed his trust in him, a complete stranger, a man who had once been a chief, a great warrior, chose to come to this place to die, and chose Arthur to be entrusted with a promise. In that final moment, Tashunka's hand found Arthur's shoulder. His touch was not forceful, but heavy with the weight of a plea. "You are a good man, Grief Walker," he whispered. "Sorrow has walked with you, but your heart is not stone." A cold draft, which had lain dormant in the house for 2 years, was suddenly chased away by the warmth of a stranger. Arthur, with a heavy sigh, carefully placed Tashunka on the simple wooden cot in the corner of the room. The boards were thick with dust, but he didn't mind. His eyes remained fixed on the frail old man. That kind of pain, Arthur knew, couldn't be soothed with words. He turned and went into the cold kitchen. On the stove, a bowl of cold soup remained, his last meal. Without a moment's hesitation, he took the bowl and brought it to the cot. "Drink," he said, his voice rough as the dust on the old things. He gently helped Tashunka sit up, a gesture he himself didn't know he was still capable of. Tashunka drank slowly, his eyes slightly open, looking straight at Arthur. In that gaze, there was no fear, only a deep gratitude. Arthur held out the bowl. "Eat a little." Tashunka shook his head, the stubbornness in his eyes never wavering. "Number, it is yours." "No," Arthur replied. He took the spoon, scooping a small portion of soup, slowly, as if he were scooping away the last bit of loneliness from himself. He brought the spoon to Tashunka's lips. Tashunka accepted it, saying nothing, only nodding faintly. In the silent room, there was only the slow slurping of soup and Tashunka's labored breathing. The single meal, a bowl of soup, was shared. The silence between them was not one of strangeness, but a wordless understanding, like two lost wanderers in a desert, finding each other in a barren oasis. After the meal, Tashunka, with his last breath, took Arthur's hand. His touch was weak, but his words were full of power. "My daughters, they are coming for me. Please take care of them." The promise of a dying man, which seemed to be only the final breath of weakness, was like a heavy stone, dropped into the placid pond of Arthur Blackwood's lonely life. It was a promise without witness, without paper, but it was heavier than any debt in the world. It was a new burden, a responsibility he never wanted, a plea he couldn't refuse. He had thought his own grief was the limit of all emotion, but now he stood before a different sorrow, one larger than himself, the pain of a father laid to rest and 5 orphan daughters. He had buried Tashunka under an ancient oak tree, where the wind sang its endless songs. The grave was simple, without a tombstone, only a piece of wood that Arthur had hastily carved. Tashunka, Grief Walker, he had etched, reluctantly and painfully, as if carving onto his own sorrow. That second name, uttered by a dead man, had become a part of him, an indelible reminder. It was then, as if by unavoidable fate, that they arrived. Not 1, but 5. 5 small, thin, yet resilient figures, shimmering in the dusty afternoon light of Lone Star. Leading them was a girl, her figure slender but her steps steady. Her face, partly obscured by a curtain of black hair, showed no fear, only a suppressed sorrow and a sharp vigilance. She was Winona, Tashunka's eldest daughter, carrying the weight of a leader for her family. Behind her were her 4 younger sisters, Istas, with intelligent, distant eyes, clutching a bundle of wild herbs, Zitkala, a small warrior with sharp eyes, always in a defensive stance, Wee, a girl with skillful hands, carrying a half-woven basket, and Mina, the youngest, clinging to her sister's back, her large eyes wide, staring blankly at the world around her. As they drew near, Arthur felt a shift in the atmosphere. It was no longer a dead silence, but a tense stillness, a potent living energy. They didn't carry many possessions, but their presence filled a void that Arthur hadn't even known existed. Winona came forward, without a word. Her eyes scanned the dilapidated house, the crooked fence, and stopped at the carved wooden marker on her father's grave. A contained sorrow appeared in her eyes, but she did not cry. She simply stood there, her silence louder than any lament. Her gaze, direct and unafraid, said everything. She was ready to face anything to protect her sisters. The wildness of the land was etched into Winona's memory from the time she was a child. The smell of damp earth, the smoke from hide lodges, and the whisper of the wind in the trees. Her father, Chief Tashunka, was a strong man whose hands not only held a bow but also wove exquisite baskets. Her mother, a woman with a gentle smile, would sing ancient songs while she wove cloaks from tanned hide. They were poor but lived in harmony until the spring of 1880, when smallpox claimed the lives of her mother and two younger sisters. Winona, just 14 then, watched her father press cold cloths to the foreheads of his loved ones, foreheads that no longer felt the warmth. She buried her mother and sisters herself under a great tree, with a simple wooden cross she had carved. 2 years later, the tribe was hunted. White men wanted their land, killing the men and taking the women as slaves. Her father fought bravely, but in time, he too became a target, relentlessly pursued. He went into hiding alone to keep his daughters from harm. Winona, then 16, was left to fend for herself and her 4 sisters. She tried to hold on to what was left of their tribe, but everything vanished like smoke. Her father promised he would find a way to return every month, but this time he left and never came back. After the burial, Winona approached Arthur, who still stood a few paces away, motionless. Her English was flawless and clear, without a hint of hesitation, which surprised Arthur. "I am Winona," she said, her voice full of authority, "Tashunka's daughter. My father said we would find a man of honor here, a protector." Her words weren't a question, but a declaration. She wasn't demanding or begging. She had come to make a pact. Arthur, a man who only spoke when necessary, was flustered. He tried to find the words, but all he could do was nod. Winona understood. She saw his calloused hands, the weariness in his eyes, and she knew this man had also lost something. She continued, her voice softening slightly, but still resolute. "We do not come as beggars. We have skills. We can hunt, gather, and heal. We will work in exchange for shelter." Her resilience and dignity stirred something within Arthur. He had thought about sending them away, that he couldn't shoulder this responsibility. But looking at Winona, he saw a fire, a life that he had lost long ago. Kindness, like a wild flower, had broken through his rough exterior. "You are welcome here," he said, his voice still rough, but with a hint of warmth. "There is not much, but what I have is yours." That night, Winona noticed the kindling by the stove was stacked a little higher, more carefully, and she stirred the stew a little longer, letting the warmth settle deep into the walls and maybe into him. Outside, the wind had softened into a hush that let the ranch breathe again. Inside, the air warmed not just with fire, but with something unfamiliar, a scent that had not visited these walls in years. It was the scent of home, of rabbit simmered gently, of wild mint weaving its subtle promise through the rising steam, and the earthy sweetness of corn flatbread cooling on a stone by the hearth. Winona stood by the stove, carefully ladling the stew into a deep clay bowl, a single utensil her father had left her. The dark broth shimmered in the lantern light, filled with tender wild potatoes, a few dried corn kernels, and a whisper of wild mint. Not from any cookbook, but embedded in her memory. It was a recipe passed down by her mother, learned by heart around crackling campfires, and shared lullabies that soothed a child to sleep. Beside the bowl, she placed a slice of corn flatbread, its edges browned just enough to break with a soft crunch. She ran her fingers over the crust, remembering the way her mother used to gently pat down the batter before baking, humming melodies that felt like sunlight itself. She carried the plate to the table and stepped back. Arthur was already seated, his rough hands folded on his lap, eyes unreadable in the dim kitchen light. He watched the food with quiet intensity, as though tasting something far beyond flavor. Winona offered a quiet nod, her voice soft like the falling snow. "It is nothing fancy, just a meal from the land." He did not reply. Instead, he reached for the spoon and dipped it into the stew. The room fell into a silence thicker than the steam. All she heard was the slow scrape of metal against clay, the soft ticking of the mantel clock, and the subtle crackle of the hearth fire. Each moment stretched longer than the one before. She stood stiffly, hands clasped in front of her, waiting, not for praise, but for permission to believe that this was enough. Arthur finished half the bowl before setting the spoon down with deliberate care. He drew a breath as if tasting the words before letting them out. "The corn flatbread. It's the kind that holds together," he said, his voice low and measured. Winona's shoulders eased as she nodded. "Cornmeal and rendered lard, no eggs. A trick from my mother, for when we lived through long winters." He listened, eyes on the bowl before shifting it toward her. "The stew is good." Her heart lifted, but her voice remained small. "Thank you." He rose then, putting his spoon back into the bowl, and stepped outside into the cold. The screen door slammed softly behind him. Winona exhaled, her shoulders slumping as the tension left her body. She turned back toward the sink, dragging the bowl behind her, still braced as though waiting for the moment he would change his mind. But she felt something settle instead, something like hope. Later that night, she made her way through the kitchen, a candle in hand and a blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. On impulse, she paused at the threshold, sensing rather than seeing. Arthur stood by the window, barely moving. And just like that, a new life began. It wasn't a grand event, but a series of small, subtle moments. The sisters began to transform the ranch, little by little. Istis, with her knowledge of plants, found edible herbs hidden in the arid wilderness. Wee-wee, with her skillful hands, mended broken baskets, creating new crafts from discarded materials. Zitkala quietly went into the woods, returning with small game for food. But the one who changed the most was Mina, the youngest. From the very first day, Mina had explored the desolate house, and in a dusty corner of the attic, she found an old wooden horse. It was the toy Arthur had made for his son who never was, something he had hidden away so he would never have to look at it again. When Mina brought the horse downstairs, it was no longer a symbol of pain. It became a toy. The child's clear laughter, the gentle tapping of wooden hooves on the floor, tore through the deathly silence that had gripped the house for 2 years. Arthur, once a man lost in his solitude, now began to become a part of a vibrant picture. He started mending the crooked fence not just as a chore, but for a new, meaningful purpose. He smelled the delicious scent of soup from the kitchen, heard the girls' quiet giggles. Life, slowly and imperceptibly, had begun to return. The next morning, Winona cracked open the door, and a blast of cold air hit her face. Lying on the porch step just outside, without a note or a knock, was a bundle of kindling and 5 fresh eggs. That was all, like a silent greeting from a man who didn't know how to greet. A small smile touched her lips as she picked them up, feeling the roughness of the wood and the cool smoothness of the eggs. She carried them inside and stepped into the kitchen, then paused. It was colder than she thought. The hearth had long gone cold. Cobwebs clung to the rafters. The smell of old ash and the loneliness of bygone years still lingered in the air. With these new items, she began to bring life back to the house. She placed the kindling in the hearth and struck a match. The fire flared up, dancing on the wood, and in a moment, warmth began to spread through the room. It was a different kind of warmth than the searing heat of the fire they had endured. It was the warmth of a home being reborn. She took the iron skillet, cracked the 2 eggs, and dropped them in. The sizzling sound of rendered lard filled the air, mingling with the aroma of the cooking meal. The kitchen, once silent, now had sound and scent. Just as she finished eating, Arthur came in. He didn't say a word, just glanced at the blazing hearth and the clean skillet. He picked up his axe, an object he was all too familiar with, and went straight outside toward the barn. Winona understood that this was how he spoke. It was his thanks, his greeting. His actions told her that he had accepted her presence and that he would continue his work to rebuild this place with her. In the following days, Arthur and Winona worked together, though they didn't do the same things. He handled the heavy labor like chopping wood, mending the fence, and reinforcing the barn. She and the sisters took on the smaller but no less important tasks like cleaning the house, organizing belongings, and cooking cozy meals. Arthur's care was not in sweet words, but in rough-hewn actions. One morning, as Winona was trying to patch an old blanket, she noticed a new needle and thread, along with a piece of soft buckskin placed on the windowsill. He said nothing, just left them there. It was his way of telling her that he had noticed her work and that he wanted to help. One afternoon, when Winona was washing clothes by the well, she noticed a small hole in the bucket. She was about to look for a replacement when Arthur appeared. He said nothing, just took the bucket and went into the barn. About an hour later, he brought it back, the bucket patched with a small piece of iron, sturdier than ever. When he handed it to her, he said gruffly, "Now it won't leak anymore." The words, though crude, brought her an unusual warmth. It showed her that he cared about even the smallest details of her life. In the evenings when they sat around the fire, Winona often told her sisters stories about their tribe. Arthur sat in the corner, silent, but always listening. His gaze was no longer distant, but directed toward the children, sometimes resting on Winona. She could feel that he wasn't just hearing the stories, but he was trying to understand them, to understand her world, and what had made her who she was. His clumsy care also manifested in his starting to pay attention to small things. He fixed the old rocking chair that had been broken for a long time, just because Mina loved to sit on it. He brought home wildflowers and placed them on the windowsill, because he had seen Winona smile when she looked at them. One evening, as Winona and Arthur sat on the porch, watching the children play, she said to him, "I will try to fix the dining table. It is a bit warped." Arthur looked at her, then at his rough hands. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice full of certainty. "I'll do it." His words were not just a promise, but a declaration. He would not let her rebuild this place alone. He would do it with her. But the Wild West was never a peaceful place, and Arthur's fragile peace was shattered by something else, an enemy from his own world. It was Garrett the Rattler Vance, a greedy, vulgar, and prejudiced rancher. He rode up to the ranch, his face full of contempt. He looked at Arthur, then at the girls, and his lips curled into a wicked, scornful smile. "I heard you've taken in some rattlers, Blackwood," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Aren't you afraid they'll bite you?" His presence was like an infection, festering the fragile peace that had just begun to grow. Winona and her sisters immediately fell silent, huddling together, their eyes filled with wariness and fear. Winona took a step forward, facing Vance, without a hint of hesitation. Vance laughed loudly, a mocking, derisive sound, and turned his attention to the girls. "Are they your property, Blackwood? I'd pay you a fair price for a few helpers out here." A cold rage rose in Arthur's chest. Compassion, protection, and responsibility all converged into one powerful emotion, a fury that had been dormant for too long. He stepped forward, standing in front of Winona, his hands slowly moving towards the shotgun hanging on the wall. His eyes, once empty, were now filled with a deadly threat. Winona, still standing her ground, looked straight into Vance's eyes, her own gaze unwavering. "We are Tashunka's daughters," she said, her voice clear and strong. "We are not property. This man, Arthur Blackwood, is a man of honor. You are not." A profound silence descended upon the ranch. The wind no longer howled, only the rapid beating of hearts could be heard. Garrett Vance, taken aback by Winona's resilience and Arthur's lethal stare, backed away. He mounted his horse, but not before giving Arthur one last look, an expression of warning and promised revenge. Arthur stood there, watching him go, and felt a surprising warmth on his arm. It was Winona's hand, a gentle touch, a simple but meaningful gesture of thanks, of trust, of a newfound alliance. The path Garrett Vance rode away on stretched out endlessly, He looked back, his eyes full of resentment. He saw a white man, a solitary rancher, and a strong Native American girl. Their eyes met, and a silent hatred was born. He didn't say a word, but they both understood that this was not the end. A profound silence fell over the ranch. Winona's hand remained on Arthur's arm. Her hand was warm, steady, a simple gesture that shattered the solitude he had built around himself. Arthur didn't pull away. He just stood there, feeling the life flowing back into him. He had once been a man with nothing but grief, but now that grief had a purpose. The following days passed in a tense quiet. Every morning, Arthur went out to fix the crumbling fence, but he was no longer alone. Winona and her sisters helped, with swift hands and a deep understanding of nature. Istis found herbs growing along the fence line, while Zitkala kept watch for wild animals. They worked in a strange harmony, with no need for words, only the crackle of burning firewood, the clang of metal against wood, and the song of the wind. Vance's wound had healed, but his resentment had not. It grew silently, like a malignant tumor. He no longer appeared openly, but his shadow was always lurking somewhere, an invisible threat that kept everyone on guard. They were no longer afraid, but they knew a storm was coming, and one day, that storm arrived. It wasn't a dust storm, but a fire. Arthur was working in the field when he smelled smoke. It wasn't the smell of charcoal, but the scent of dry wood, of kindling burning. He looked up, seeing a huge cloud of black smoke curling up from the direction of the ranch. A cold panic ran through him. He turned and ran toward the house. When he arrived, the flames had already consumed half of the barn, where his only cow was bellowing in terror. Vance and two other men stood there, laughing loudly, their eyes full of savage delight. "Nobody talks to Vance that way, Blackwood," he yelled. "This is a lesson for you, and for your little snakes." In that moment, Arthur was no longer Grief Walker. He was a protector. He looked at the raging fire, at the furious faces of Vance's men, and he looked at Winona. She stood there, holding a bucket, her face set with determination. She wasn't afraid. She looked at him, her eyes not waiting for a hero. They held trust. They worked together with astonishing synchronization. Arthur, with a farmer's strength, grabbed a shovel and tried to beat back the flames. He wasn't fighting for the cow. He wasn't fighting for the ranch. He was fighting for a family. Winona, with her wisdom and quick hands, used water to soak the surrounding wooden planks, creating a barrier to stop the fire from spreading. She ordered her sisters to evacuate to a safe place. The fire raged, and screams echoed, but Arthur and Winona stood there, back to back. Vance's men hadn't expected such resistance. Finally, defeated by their sheer will and fierce opposition, they mounted their horses and rode away. When the fire was out, all that was left was a pile of ash and charred wood. The cow had escaped, but the barn was completely destroyed. Arthur stood there, his shoulders slumped with fatigue and grief. He had saved everything, but he had lost a small part of himself. Winona walked over to him. She didn't say a word, just placed a hand on his shoulder. That touch was not one of pity, but of understanding. It was as if she were saying, "We made it through. We're okay." Arthur turned and looked into her eyes. He saw a hidden pain and a flicker of hope that still smoldered. He reached out and touched her hand. In that moment, there were no words, no romance, just two broken people who had found each other in a world full of hatred. He looked at Winona, at her sisters, at the ruined ranch, and he knew that this was his new life. A life with no more solitude, no more fear. It was a life with responsibility, with love, and with a family. "This is our home," he said, his voice full of resolve, "and no one is going to take it from us." The night that fell over Arthur Blackwood's ranch was no longer a dead silence. Instead, it carried the scent of smoke and ash, a bitter smell of loss that was also the scent of survival. Half the barn was now cinder, and in the faint moonlight, the long shadows of the ruins lay like open wounds. Arthur and Winona sat side by side on the porch steps, not speaking a word. The silence was no longer loneliness, but a full space, like a warm blanket between them. After a while, Winona spoke, her voice as gentle as a passing breeze. She pulled her knees to her chest, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "My mother, she once told a story," she said, her eyes gazing at the pile of ash, as if seeing something that had happened long ago. "She burned a whole deer roast to a crisp because she was too busy telling me about how my father asked her to marry him." Arthur tilted his head, his eyes still on the smoldering ruins. His hat was pulled low to ward off the chill. The corners of his lips quirked, and a faint, almost inaudible chuckle escaped him. It was a soft, brief sound, but it was real. It was the first time Winona had ever heard him laugh. She turned her head slightly, stealing a glance. In the starlight, his face looked gentler than usual, the shadows kinder. She did not say anything more, just let the sound of his laughter hang in the air between them. "My father, he ate the whole thing," Winona continued, her voice softer. "My mother was crying, but my father just took a bite and said, 'Burned love is still love if it's warm.' And he ate the entire piece. I laughed so hard I nearly choked. My mother started laughing too. She always did get mad at herself more than anyone else." When the night deepened and they stood to go inside, Arthur paused by the door. "I'll fix the fence as soon as the sun rises," he said, his voice low and warm. Winona blinked. "Why?" "A home needs a strong fence," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "And you need a place to grow wildflowers." Winona nodded, her heart skipping a small beat. "Thank you," she said. Her gratitude was not just for the fence, but for a heart that was finally willing to open. 1 year later, the Blackwood Ranch was no longer a dead land. A new fence had been built, sturdy and straight, enclosing a small garden where wildflowers bloomed. The barn had been rebuilt, larger and more solid, and the laughter of 5 girls echoed everywhere, chasing away the silence that had reigned for so many years. It was the laughter of life, of hope, of a family that had found each other. One hot summer afternoon, a stranger appeared. He was a strong young warrior with tribal tattoos on his arms. He rode a dark horse, his eyes scanning the ranch. When he dismounted, Winona recognized him as a man from her old tribe. "We have found a new land," he said, his voice filled with pride. "A safe place where everyone can live together. The tribe has been united." He looked at Winona. "Your father was a great man. It is time for you and your sisters to return to your roots." Winona listened to those words, and in her heart, a silent battle began. On one side was the call of her ancestors, of blood, and on the other was the home, the family she had built with her own hands. Her sisters stood behind her, their innocent eyes looking from Arthur to the strange man. They did not want to go. Tears were already streaming down Mina's cheeks. That afternoon, as the sun began to sink to the west, the 5 girls mounted their horses. They carried few belongings, only the clay pot and a few blankets. The wind blew at their backs, like a whisper from the past, a promise from their ancestors. Arthur stood watching them leave, not saying a word, his face expressionless, but in his eyes there was a profound sadness. That night, alone by the fireplace, he felt the old silence return. The ranch once again felt vast and empty. He looked at Mina's wooden horse, and in that moment, he felt his heart break into 1,000 pieces. However, the next afternoon, something unexpected happened. The sunset painted the valley in hues of orange and gold, and from a distance, he saw 5 small figures returning. The sound of their boots was light on the dirt road. The wind no longer blew at their backs, but in cool breezes that seemed to be guiding them. Winona dismounted her horse and ran to him. Her eyes were filled with determination. "I feel we cannot go on," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "As the sun is about to set behind the distant hill, I think you need a dinner." She took a breath, then continued, "We will not leave, unless you yourself send us away. We felt the wind. Where the heart is warmest, that is home." Arthur looked at her, then at her 4 sisters standing behind her. He had once been a lonely man, but now he had a family. The greatest gift her father had left behind was not a tribe, but her resilience and love. He slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple silver ring, something he had kept hidden for many years. It was not a luxury item, but Eleanor's memento. "This is not just my promise," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "but a promise for a new life, with you." He placed the ring on Winona's finger. She nodded softly, gripping his hand tightly. The pain of the past had turned into hope. As night fell, they stood by the graves of Tashunka and Eleanor. They placed a wildflower on each grave. A sacred silence fell over them. Then they turned, hand in hand, and walked toward the house, where the light glowed with an infinite warmth. Arthur paused by the old fence, where a wooden sign, faded by sun and rain, had been hanging for a very long time. The words, "For sale," were almost gone, but he could still see them. It was his declaration to the world, to himself, that this place was dead, that he would leave to find peace in a new land, a place without pain. He quietly took the sign down. It let out a small creak, like the final sigh of the past. He looked at it, at the words, "For sale," and he smiled. The grief that had once forced him to leave this place was gone, but love had kept him here. He didn't need to sell this place, because this was no longer a place to bury pain. Arthur threw the sign into the ashes of the old barn. It flared into a small fire and quickly vanished. He watched the fire, and he smiled. Because sometimes, he thought, home is not a place to sell, but a place to live. Where the heart is warmest, that is home.